Hi, this is Lex, and welcome to the FinTech Blueprint. It's your podcast about fintech, decentralized finance, digital banking, investing, robo-advice, artificial intelligence, and all the other frontier technology that is transforming financial services. To get more content, like an illustrated transcript of this conversation in your inbox, subscribe at fintechblueprint.com. So without further delay, let's jump into today's episode. Today's podcast is a collaboration with ConsenSys, the market-leading blockchain technology company. Given its core position in the Ethereum ecosystem, we're able to bring you the most captivating industry insiders, from technologists and entrepreneurs to designers and creatives from all around the world. So join us for inspiring conversations on the future of finance, crypto, and what is making up the new decentralized web. Welcome, everybody. I'm so excited for today's conversation with Gabriel Anderson, the managing director of Tachyon. Tachyon's an accelerator focused on Web3 in the ConsenSys family, and there's some fantastic companies and things to learn from there. And so with that, Gabriel, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Max. Really appreciate it, man. Appreciate you spending some time and excited to sit here and chat and jam for a little bit with you.
Absolutely. So let's start with your journey, and I guess, what did you do before all this blockchain technology accelerator stuff? What were you focused on?
Yeah, super unconventional path, I think, how I ended up here. So immediately prior to Web3 and blockchain, I was kind of running as EIR within a company here in New York called VaynerMedia, VaynerX. It's run by a pretty well-known entrepreneur, at least in the Web2 ecosystem, named Gary Vaynerchuk. And I'd been at Vayner for about 6 years. I actually started out in performance analytics with him. We can talk about my previous startup experience, but I had just kind of left my third startup, and which was in the prop tech space. And I was looking, at that time, I was looking for what was kind of like cutting edge and the, kind of the convergence of what was happening within the social media landscape. And this is going back now, circa 2012. I was really really fascinated in what I was starting to see happen between technology and kind of like the convergence of technology and ecosystems. And so social media was just kind of like, the thing to be in. And so I started out in performance analytics, and then I built our growth engineering team, and Gary was doing a bunch of early stage venture investing, and so I started running growth for a bunch of our incubated companies, and then started and launched a couple of businesses within the Vayner wrapper, the Vayner ecosystem. So one of them was an owned media platform. Back then it was called Vayner Publishing. Today it's called The Gallery. We built that. I built that into a business that was doing north of 100 million MAUs. Pretty, much easier on a media type of business. And then Gary acquired a website called PureWow. Phenomenal CEO. Ryan stepped in, and so then I built and bootstrapped our SME business, and built that into a $10 million run rate business. But yeah, I had kind of been sniffing around the crypto ecosystem for a number of years. I'd come across the Bitcoin white paper, and I think around 2000, it was probably 2017, maybe 2018. When the ICO boom was really starting to take off. I have a finance background. I started my career in finance.
Yeah, I wasn't gonna let you get away talking about social media and marketing without sort of pinning you to Morgan Stanley and Merrill Lynch, like the rest of us bankers. You're not gonna get away with that. You know how to do financial modeling. You're guilty.
Yeah, fair. You got me. You caught me. I mean, listen, I grew up in a lower middle income family, and so money was a mystery in my house, and so yes, I came out of school. I went into investment banking. I joined Merrill Lynch on the institutional cash management desk. This was in Southern California. PIMCO was one of our big clients, but yeah, I do have a background in finance, and and I will say I was looking at what was happening in the crypto space and what was happening with ICOs, and I was highly skeptical. I was very skeptical in terms of what I was seeing. And so I had this good friend, Sean Chang, who's also at ConsenSys. He had been at ConsenSys for a number of years at that point, and he was the one that I would go. He was my crypto friend. He's the one that got me down the rabbit hole. And so we would talk. We would grab dinner and we would talk about what was happening within the Web3 crypto space, and I would tell him I was highly skeptical, and I was skeptical because I was nervous that what was happening within the ICO realm was getting frothy and would turn into a bubble, and I believed in blockchain, the technology, and I think that was the thing that I was really drawn to. And so, anyways, Sean guides me, is my guide down the crypto rabbit hole, and gives me a bunch of white papers that, he asked me, well, what are you interested in? And what makes you most interested in crypto? And I had a couple of themes back then. And he gave me a couple of white papers to go check out. I think Ocean Protocol was actually the first one that I took a look at. And ConsenSys was doing some really cool things. My third startup was in the prop tech space. And so I was really interested in seeing, this was a really early idea, but real world assets starting to hit the blockchain. I was really curious about things like increasing the velocity of capital. And so, Sean kind of introduced me to a couple of companies that he thought I would like. And I remember my partner and I were flying to Toronto, and I was taking a little bit of time off. And I spent that whole trip holed up in our Airbnb, just digging around these ecosystems and digging around these companies. And I was bit after that. And so, yeah, it's kind of an unconventional path, I guess, into crypto, into Web3, from traditional finance, CFI to my startup background to going in-house as EIR. But really, really glad, I think we all need that friend that can pull us into the rabbit hole. And really glad that Sean Chang was the one who did that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's not a conventional path, and if anything, it's an attractor for people with really diverse and mixed backgrounds. We talk to people who are from the art world, and were interested in generative art, but somehow ended up building gigantic financial ecosystems. And then this combination of social media and community is really, really natural, because it just lays the groundwork for understanding that money is not an object, but rather like a set of relations between people.
Yeah.
And so the social media bit makes a lot of sense. Okay, so how do you think about community now, and how do you think about what's happening to that Web2 social media world? Certainly Gary's been very engaged in NFT land.
Yeah. So how do I think of community? I think community and composability are kind of the two killer features of Web3 technology companies, right? And if you start to think about the way that I think about it is, it's crypto's unfair competitive advantage, are those two aspects. And so, certainly companies that can utilize what I think are some of the inherent best practices of Web2 in building, high growth, companies within the Web2 landscape, but then start to interlayer in the idea of building a community around your product, and then how your company or how your product fits into the Lego stack, as either a go-to-market strategy or as a moat. I think are two kind of the killer features of Web3, and we've seen this play out, time and time again, certainly within the companies within the Tachyon ecosystem, in terms of being that unfair competitive advantage. I mean, so much of this ecosystem is driven by, finding your key stakeholder communities and wrapping culture, around your product, and then letting those key stakeholder communities, be your early users, your backers, your financial backers in some case. You get so much bang for the buck when you think about, the challenges to going from 0 to 1 as an early stage company. You have some inherent advantages as a Web3 company. And I think that's why NFTs, by the way, and definitely Gary and the whole Vayner ecosystem, has really gotten into it in a big way. NFTs, I think, for normies, for non-crypto people, was the first thing within crypto that they could look at where you didn't need to be overly technical to understand what was happening. I mean, some of us in the crypto space, and I would definitely consider myself. I would use this descriptor for myself. We're kind of pirates. We're square pegs in round holes. And in the NFT landscape, what was happening in NFTs was the first thing that I think non-crypto degens or normies could look at and could go, "Oh, I understand that." I like to say that NFTs are simply the financialization of culture. And, anytime you start putting new tools, new technology into the hands of creators and the creator class, I think that's when you get really unique and really interesting things that start to take place. And we can talk about this maybe at a later time, but it's why I'm really excited to see what's going to happen with things like gaming and gaming platforms as those start to come into the Web3 ecosystem. Gaming platforms to surf on top of crypto economics, I think is going to be, I think will onboard 5 to 10x what NFTs has.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm going to slow us down a little bit because we're in crypto PhD land, which, by the way, works. It works in reverse, right? So the younger you are, the more these words make sense, right? So we talked about the creator economy there, which is just this idea of influence, let's say, turning into beautiful things or making stuff together and having your community with you. And then we talked about normies and degens, and to map that back to the Merrill Lynch world, which a bunch of our listeners probably are still from, right? That's your risk tolerance. Are you high risk seeking, or you risk avoiding, and so on? But we'll open up those concepts in a little bit. Maybe
Yeah.
just re-anchoring in Tachyon and the Accelerator. Can you talk a little bit about what that even is? Like, what's the purpose of an accelerator? What is it? And in particular, what does Tachyon focus on?
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So let's just start from the base, and we can build our way up. So for those that are unfamiliar with Tachyon, let me just start by telling the audience a little bit about what we do. So as you pointed out, Tachyon sits inside of ConsenSys Mesh. And ConsenSys Mesh collectively has incubated and invested, at this stage, probably north of 100 projects and companies, many of which are some of the key pillars of the Ethereum ecosystem. So this would be companies like Infura, like MetaMask, like Threebox, Pegasus, Truffle, Gitcoin, and many more. Tachyon is our accelerator for early stage companies. So since 2017, Tachyon, which is an accelerator, it's for the most ambitious early stage Web3 founders. We've had 5 cohorts. We have over 75 active alumni companies, and we've had the pleasure of working with some phenomenal Web3 startups. So this is companies like Nuo or Idle or Transact or Outlet or PiDAO or Parcel, Multisafe, Valis, so many great companies. And what we do is twice a year, we bring together the most, as I said, ambitious Web3 founders for an intense 12-week sprint. We help them hone their value proposition. We help them test their assumptions with real customers, and we prepare them for the next phase of their investment and growth, which happens at what we call a demo day. The way that we help these companies, and what we do is we give these teams a little bit of seed capital. They get a whole lot of one-on-one mentorship from myself and the Tachyon staff. All of us, and this was important when I took over as managing directors, all of us have been founders. We've been entrepreneurs. So our advice is not theoretical, not something that we read on a blog post somewhere. We have been in the trenches, continue to still be in the trenches as entrepreneurs, as founders. And so, we spend a lot of time with our founders, really helping to mentor them, and give them access to our networks. They go through weekly programming, all to try to help them navigate the product maze. And again, we don't believe you threw the baby out with the bathwater. We think there's some really good principles of building a high growth technology company from Web 2. We just think that there are some nuances when you do so in the Web 3 crypto ecosystem. And so yeah, that's I guess maybe I'll pause there. It's a little bit about Tachyon. As I said, everything culminates in what's called a demo day, where our companies begin their fundraising to go out and raise for their next stage of growth.
So what's the difference between an accelerator with its cohorts and an incubator? How does
Yeah.
somebody who is just starting a project and let's say has now whatever 4 billion in a side chain they accidentally built. How do they make a choice between being accelerated or being incubated?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. So the framework that I use, or the mental model that I have for this, is you need both, especially within Web3. But incubation is typically before you have a working product, before you have an MVP. Incubation, I think, is really good when you need patient capital, or when you're working in deep tech, or it's a really good model for allowing entrepreneurs and to come in to an ecosystem and then put around industry experts or domain experts around them, and really kind of get into the messy discovery phase of a product. So it's typically a pre MVP, pre product type of ecosystem. Acceleration, or an accelerator, is really good when you are post product, when you have a working MVP, when you've shipped a little bit of code. You might not have found problem solution fit or product market fit yet, and that's pretty typical, especially of the companies that we back in the early days. But you do have kind of a general sense of the product and what you're building. And what you really need is, you need a little bit of capital, you need access to a network, and you need some time with various experts to really hone and test some of your key assumptions, and the key assumptions that you have around your problem solution product market fit. And so that's what an accelerator, I think, is really good for. There are different models, right? So I'm kind of using some rules of thumb here, but incubation usually lasts. You'll see incubators that have programs that'll go anywhere from 3 months, which is the same as an accelerator, to 4 to 6 months, somewhere around there. And accelerators are I think on the shorter end, between 6 weeks to 12 weeks at the max time frame. And Tachyon is a 12-week accelerator.
Gotcha. And is it broadly focused on Web3, or is it particular themes? And then what is Web3 even? We've used the words a bunch,
Yeah.
but what is it?
So we are focused on the Ethereum ecosystem, but our thesis is, and this will tie into your second question. Our thesis is that Web3 will be synonymous with the internet. And so we work with companies that are building on or around the Ethereum ecosystem, but we back and support companies, that are really building a more open, transparent, interoperable internet. And so, we have partnered, for example, with a company called Protocol Labs, who are makers of some amazing technologies called IPFS and Filecoin, amongst other technologies. We think that that's a different ecosystem, Web3 ecosystem, if you will, but they play very nice together. What we believe, our thesis is kind of maybe a two-part thesis. The first is that Web3 will be synonymous with all of the internet at some point. And we believe that Ethereum will be the final settlement layer of that internet. But there are a lot of side chains, that we think can play really nice with the Ethereum ecosystem. There are also parts of the Web3 stack which I would say Filecoin and IPFS are, which are complementary to the Ethereum blockchain technology stack. And then to answer your second question, I guess more directly, what is Web3? Web3 is just the current incarnation of the internet. So, Web 1, was the early days of the internet, that came out of DARPA. It was all about information, open protocols primarily driving that. Web 2.0, which is where I, really built my startup career, we were just talking about, and same with the social media platforms, was all about information and people. And it was about building networks on top of this information infrastructure. And then Web3, at least the way that I think about it or define it, is just the next incarnation of that. And that's, information, people, and native money sitting within the digital realm. And so, yeah, so again, we believe, our whole thesis is that Web3 will be, we won't call it Web3 anymore. We'll just call it the internet. And it'll be synonymous with the internet. But I think we're still in the early days of Web3, as it starts to eat the rest of the Web2 stack.
Yeah, totally makes sense. I think one thing to maybe pause on and also define is, what is a stack? I think participants in this industry have a pretty established mental model of how technologies combine and build upon each other. But it's quite different from the prior systems of value, right? So we're kind of attaching value to, as you said, information and people. And historically, value sat in its own industry ecosystem and had its own technology value chain. And so, for example, a core banking system or a portfolio management system or a card payment rail, I mean, it didn't really want either information or people. It wanted to be guarded by the tallest walls possible, and then to get your passport when you come in, right? And so we're in a moment where there's a world that's designed which is orthogonal to that. It flips that idea, right? So what are the components of this world that, in plain words, really kind of jigsaw puzzle it together?
Yeah, I think so each piece is kind of built on top of the previous piece, whether that's the actual technology component or the ethos, the key parts or components. But the way that I think about the quote unquote stack, you have like the core internet protocols. So HTTP, is kind of like the initial key internet protocol that allowed information to traverse across, from node to node in the network. And that was great for putting up things like static web pages, right? Like I think like you probably remember, like I remember, God, how old was I? Maybe 11, 12 years old when that first AOL disk arrived in my mailbox, which was kind of the portal to the online world. And so we had all these static web pages. And so that was kind of the first piece of the quote unquote internet stack. And then what happened was especially as high bandwidth throughput started to become possible. My very first company, by the way, was a webzine called ocpartyscene.com. I was 17 years old, and we were covering kind of like the underground music industry that was happening in Southern California. Started in Orange County. We eventually made our way to LA. I was a raver back back then. But
That's important. Somebody has to do the work. It's hard
so
work to be a raver, and you were
that's
doing it.
right. That's
Yeah.
right. This is just as video started making its way onto online, and I remember we were covering some of my favorite DJs that were in the underground, music space that was happening. And so, I guess the second part of the stack is we started getting rich media that became possible as more throughput became possible, more bandwidth became, started opening up. I think many of us probably remember you moving from dial-up to high throughput bandwidth, and so that's maybe the second piece of the stack. And then as we start moving from there, what became possible were things like social networks. Being able to create communities, rich communities that had the ability and the capability of developing rich media. And so with each part of the quote unquote stack, we get richer and better online experiences. But and I was a part of this quote unquote problem. I think one of the problems that we made in Web 2, in the Web 2 world, is we created these amazing rich ecosystems with rich media experiences, but we created them as silos. One, we created them as silos, and two, we had to figure out a way to pay for this. So we introduced an advertising model, right? We didn't want the users to pay for this. I having built a number of businesses on the back of this this first party data that was available within these Web2 ecosystems, I was a part of utilizing this rich and robust first party data to growth hack or grow my startups and the various companies that I was building. And so, I think we made some fundamental mistakes, or we had some fundamental flaws in how we paid for this, how we built all of this. So the next piece in the stack with Web3, cryptonomics, is introducing internet money, native internet money. So, we went from these, bland pages of information to these rich media and rich ecosystem experiences with Web 2. And now we're just layering in native internet money, and money is just a mechanism, a means of transferring value and coordinating human beings. So, I mean, ultimately, I think where this is all going And I don't know how down far into the rabbit hole we want to get here, but ultimately, right, like we're going to enable all new coordination, mechanisms, because we'll have native internet incentive mechanisms. I think that's kind of where this is all going. So, not to get too heady again, like I'm sure you'll pull us back out here, but that's how, at least in my head, that's how I think about the quote unquote stack.
Yep. Totally. I'm with you. And, I want to go and describe the Borganism that we're all building, where the economic machines will bring us into the Matrix. Speaking of which, I hear Matrix 4 is coming out. So I'm
Cannot
sure
wait.
it'll exactly. It'll inspire the next 20 years of science fiction and startups. Okay. So I want to go in two directions with the accelerator question, with the Tachyon questions. And, I'd love to understand the trends, and you've touched on a bunch of them, but, the the core trends that you are excited about and think are investable over the next 2 to 3 years. And then I want to talk about sort of a look back at the portfolio and what the learnings were, and if you missed, or not you, but if the accelerator missed, or things the market missed in some way. But before looking back, maybe we just start with the straight question, which is, we're in a fairly crazy place in a good way, in that everything's changed much faster than anyone has expected. The financial rails are there with decentralized finance, the dollar rails are there with stable coins, the computational rails are there with 4 or 5 different side chains and L2s and other networks that can provide quite a lot of computation. UI UX is getting better, and then the creator economy with NFTs and media and gaming and DAOs has started to shift over. So everything's so fast, right? And so the question is, as you look out for the next 2 to 3 years, what are some of the more, let's say, discrete, describable, investable themes that you see that the accelerator is both interested in, and then you as an entrepreneur would be excited about?
Yeah. Okay. So a couple of really good questions there. So theme. So with every cohort, it's like, so for example, this cohort, when we opened up applications to entrepreneurs that were building, we opened up applications in July 2021. And we were just at the beginning of what I would call NFT summer when applications open. But for us on Tachyon, what we try to do, we don't always nail it, but what we attempt to do is we try to look forward and think about, what do the next 12 to 18 months look like? And what are the companies that are like basically skating to where the puck is going, right? And so I think the first iteration, the first generation of NFT companies that was happening when we first opened the applications for this current program were super interesting and super fascinating. But I was less interested in Gen 1 of what we were seeing in the space, and much more interested in what I thought, was kind of Gen 2. And this actually fits nicely with your question. So in terms of the themes that we're seeing, I think there are a couple of themes that are starting to emerge that I think will be investable over the next 2 to 3 years. And I'll point out the ones that I'm really excited about. So the first one, maybe, and then this is such a hard exercise, by the way, because of what I was talking about earlier. Composability means that things move really, really fast, right? You're never starting from scratch. You can just pull a piece from the stack and kind of build on top of it. And so I think the next iteration of composability is convergence, and we're starting to see that now, which is really exciting. But it also makes it very hard to predict what's coming. But I think if I were to kind of like zoom out, maybe from a 30,000 foot view, the trends that I think are going to emerge over the next 2 to 3 years, and that we also are seeing right now in this current batch, I mentioned one of them earlier, but gaming. I think gaming companies that can surf on top of crypto economics are going to onboard 5 to 10x what NFTs did in terms of like the non-crypto native ecosystem. And the reason is just very simple. If you're a game publisher today, your monetization, you only have two abilities to monetize, right? You're either like a major video game publisher, like a Fortnite, or one of the others, and or you can introduce like shitty advertising inside of the in-app experience. Neither of which are ideal for kind of like the long tail or mid tail of game publishers. But now, if game publishers all of a sudden have a new mechanic like crypto economics in terms of a monetization strategy, and we're already seeing this. This is not a Tachyon company, but if you look at a company like Axie Infinity, kind of this play to earn model, you have people around the world in emerging markets that during the COVID lockdown were able to make more money than what their quote unquote job was in their market playing these games. That's pretty bonkers when you start to think about it. I have, by the way, I have a whole thesis that, gaming mechanics as front ends for in any incentive or mechanism design that you want to design for will start to be introduced. Like you get introduced a gaming mechanism on top of a DAO and incentivize for the job that needs to be done for that particular DAO. I don't think games are going to remain just video games. I think they will be the new front ends for any type of mechanism design or incentive design that we want. But so, sorry, we're probably getting really into the rabbit hole right now. But
No, it's fantastic.
I would say gaming is a space that I'm really, really excited about. I think similar to NFTs, you can just be a gamer. You don't even need to really understand or be crypto native, and you could look at a game like Axie Infinity and say to yourself, oh, I got that. I understand what that is. You might need a little bit of onboarding into like MetaMask, but after that, you're off to the races. So I think that's really exciting. I think what I would call go
So
ahead.
let me just pause on that for a second, because I think depending on the life journeys that people take to this information, and especially for folks who are not digital all the time, I think one of the revelations that comes out of blockchain-based systems, and in particular the literal economic design of those systems, meaning you have to create an economy in which people transact and in which they have supply and demand in different markets and different financial instruments and so on, is that there's nothing particularly special about quote unquote the real economy. Like, yes, it is the largest and it is today, in the real world, and we are familiar with it as sort of the locus or the epicenter of where we are, but it's kind of like an earth-centric view of the world, right? Just because we're on the earth, we're at the center of the universe and everything revolves around us, which is of course
Yep.
false, or probabilistically false, I guess. um,
Yeah.
so what I think, once you start spending a lot of time and seeing economies everywhere and seeing capitalism and supply demand everywhere, and then spending a lot of time thinking about how software is there to intermediate that or instantiate that, make that real for the people who are using blockchain based software systems for their living or for their transactions, you start seeing everything as a creatable economy. It is no more difficult to create, as in the 1700s, the American economy is slowly expanding from the east to the west, as it is to create Axie Infinity, which
Yes.
certainly has a bigger economy than America at that time did. And so you start seeing the ability to create these ecosystems everywhere. And then you start realizing that the word game, they are all games in the sense that they're all participatory, where we as actors have utility functions that we fulfill, and then we fulfill them relative to the crowd or relative to sort of organizations of people. And so everything is, in a sense, a game. And then you start applying that backwards to the real world, right? And so people wearing particular clothing or behaving in a particular way or getting particular degrees or licenses or certifications, you start seeing the outlines of how all these incentives are structured. And so one of the reason all the crypto people sound insane is because they've spent a lot of time actually trying to design new versions of these things, and that kind of, it unmoors you from the assumption. You start seeing what the rules are that are already in place.
Lex, that is such a massive insight. Like one of the things that I've been playing around with this idea in my head of why I think things like gaming would be such a massive onboarding tool into crypto. And one of the ideas that I have is it's around the erosion of the third space, right? So like my parents' generation, they had work, home, and I don't know what, church, right? Maybe in my early days, younger days, it was, work, home, and I don't know, like the mall. That third space has started to slowly erode. And I think what's happening is it's being replaced by the expansion of, what we would just call the metaverse, these online ecosystems. And these online ecosystems, because of what you just pointed out, are so good and so efficient at game mechanics and coordination of human behavior that they're actually now starting to replace work in a lot of cases. So everything eventually becomes an incentive design and the coordination mechanism of how you do incentive design. And so listen, for the 24-year-old in Vietnam who put food on their table during the COVID lockdown playing Axie Infinity, these are not just games, right? Like, these quote unquote games were translated into bread on the table. So I think gaming, which kind of folds into this idea of the metaverse, as you can tell, I'm very, very excited about what is going to happen as these ecosystems get better, get richer, get more vibrant, are much easier to get into. The UX issues that maybe crypto still has get solved as we introduce things like L2 solutions for being able to stream micro value that sits atop these decentralized networks, that are kind of surfing on top of these crypto financial rails. It's just, you and I have seen that. We've seen this play out already. We know how this ends. We saw this in Web2. I built entire companies on top of seeing this play out previously. So I think it's a really exciting time, to be in crypto. I mean, this is just gaming and again, like composability and convergence, right? So I'm kind of like, now I may be, for your audience, conflating a couple of things, but and that's because they're not pure silos, but it's, gaming surfing on top of or converging with DeFi, surfing on top and converging with, the quote unquote metaverse. We're seeing NFTs. I think a lot of people who don't know what's happening in the NFT ecosystem kind of look at these things and say, I don't understand. Why are these digital rocks selling for millions of dollars? And I'm really excited about Gen 2, Gen 3 of NFTs, right? So all NFTs are these N of one assets, that are secured and that can be self-sovereign on the internet. What happens when these N of one assets are now utilized within the creator economy as a part of unlocking user experiences, right? Again, like anytime you introduce a new tool or tool set for creators, you get all kinds of new incantations or new versions of things that you have not seen before, new iterations of things that you have not seen before. And so as these tools start getting put into the hands of creators, these unique assets that have, programmability, what does that mean for a creator who can utilize these assets to continue the consumer journey as their consumers or as their users follow along with them? Many of these artists and creators are now starting to tokenize themselves. And if this sounds weird or strange or like you don't quite get it, I mean, we've seen this in Web2. If you just look at the analogous Web2 world, things like Lambda School introducing income share agreements, ISAs. What's the difference between that and a creator just tokenizing their body of work and then utilizing that for as a means for their audience to then purchase these unique assets that unlock or ungate things like their, I don't know, private Discord group, or you can imagine utilizing these assets as like your ticket to go see your favorite musician at Madison Square Garden, and then it unlocks a limited edition 500 hoodies for people who attended the concert. Like it's when you start layering in the programmability of these N=1 assets that I think creators are going to have a heyday with Web3 and Web3 technologies. I mean, I think we're already seeing kind of like the emergence of this new creator economy. So I think that's really exciting. And I know we're really far away from your original question, which which is like investable ideas over the next 2 to 3 years. There are many or a number of them, but maybe we can pause there. I mean, those are two that I think are just very obvious if you're kind of seeing what's happening in Web3, at least Gen 1 of what we're seeing right now, and you start to ask yourself, like, how does this start to play out? I think those are some areas that people should be looking at and paying attention to. And we have some amazing companies in this current cohort that are playing within those domains that I'm really excited about.
That's awesome. Yeah, fantastic. Are there any projects that come to mind in particular that that you think are really hitting it in terms of these concepts?
Yeah. Well, so for example, in maybe first talking about Tachyon companies, we have a company in the current cohort. They're called Clam Island. They are gamifying investments, so DeFi basically, with the power of, so some of you in your audience are probably familiar with concepts of like yield farming and NFTs. And so this company is just creating a gaming mechanic for DeFi yield farming. Utilizing things like they have these things that are clams. They're unique, and they produce digital pearls. And then these pearls can be used to stake and then continue to acquire more clams that produce more pearls. You can kind of see where this is going. Each of these clams has unique attributes, that are randomized via the blockchain. If I own this clam, it sits in my wallet. I own it. It can't be taken away from me from the platform. So I think that's a really exciting company. There's one that you and I would probably geek over. Hedgie is their name. Hedgie is a protocol for adding options markets to any token. And they're building the ability to create American style options within the DeFi ecosystem, really focused first doing covered call options to help DAOs unlock the $50 billion of native tokens that are sitting in their treasury. So that's a company that I think is really exciting within the current ecosystem. I think the other thing that we didn't touch on this theme, but what happens when bots or automation, or machine learning starts getting applied to the blockchain and these decentralized financial applications. So there's we have two companies actually in the cohort that are doing really cool things within this domain. Autonomy Network is one of them. They're building decentralized automation, basically helping DEXs with things like stop losses and limit orders, where you can stake their token. It's a utility token, and then the bots, the automation will go to work for that particular DEX. Or a company like Bodo in this cohort, they're building no code. It's a no code platform, so you don't need to be a developer. You don't need to know Solidity or anything like that. But they're allowing for automation within DeFi and NFT ecosystems using bots. They literally have like a WYSIWYG where you can connect what's happening in DeFi to things like Web2 ecosystems, like whether it be like Telegram or Slack, so you can do things like get notifications when certain thresholds are hit, or their next iteration is where the bot will actually start trading based on your preconditions. So think of it like Zapier basically for DeFi. I think that's a really cool company. And then then there are tons of companies that are not Tachyon companies that I think have just are doing amazing things as well. But yeah, to your point, I'm probably missing, definitely missing a bunch of great companies, but things are moving so fast. But yeah, maybe those are a couple that I would point out.
Awesome. Cool. Well, I guess to bring it home and then to think about some of the stuff maybe as an analyst or as an investor, one of the things that we probably want to highlight are things that didn't happen, things that we expected to happen but didn't, and some of the learnings from that, right? So through the incubator, right, there's been over 100 projects, and some of them are fantastically successful. MetaMask now, I think, is over 10 million monthly average users, but not everything worked, and some of that is timing, and some of that is like a secular misunderstanding, and so there's so much excitement now. Are there any sort of filters or curation or frameworks that you'd use to say, well, some of the things that are going on clearly don't make sense, and in the past we've gone down these roads, and and they didn't work. Some of the stuff doesn't work. So if somebody wants to bring that more critical or skeptical view, how do they do that to get to a truth?
Yeah, so I think the simple heuristic is kind of like the initial meta filter is, why does this need a blockchain? right? Right now, blockchains are not faster than than traditional architectures. And so the question that you want to ask is like, why does this need a blockchain? How does a blockchain solution make this a 10x solution? So like early ideas, and definitely not going to call out any companies specifically, but I think we all got excited about things like, or at least I won't. I won't put you in this camp. I'll own a couple of these. So, like, I got really excited about thinking about like supply chain on the blockchain. But then you started thinking about like all the UX issues and how does that item actually make its way onto the blockchain in the first place? And it just didn't make sense, right? Like, we were thinking about, not needing to have a trusted third party to certify certain things, I think was kind of like the core thesis there. But when you actually unpacked the user experience and what that was relative to my alternatives in the marketplace, it wasn't a good one. Maybe there are probably others, right? Like I think you and I maybe saw a bunch of the let's do like a decentralized Airbnb or a decentralized Uber. And those businesses they require network effects, and similar problem with the supply chain one, which is like if you actually start to sit back and think about like what's the UX there, it's not a 10x solution relative to my options in the marketplace. I certainly got like really excited in the early days of crypto about things like tokenized real estate or like real world assets on the blockchain. I think that's just now starting to happen, which that was probably more of a timing issue. But blockchain just was not a 10x solution to that, right? Like it just didn't it didn't actually solve an actual problem. And I think that's the meta filter. That is if you're looking for just a simple like heuristic or rule of thumb, it's just, why does this need a blockchain? And how does having a blockchain solution create a 10x experience usually for the user? How does blockchain have an unfair competitive advantage relative to my options in the market? Because all companies exist in a marketplace and must compete against their options within the market. And so when we look back, at maybe some earlier investment ideas or themes, I think that would be that meta filter and that kind of heuristic would be like kind of the overriding one. And then when we start looking at specific examples, like those are the two that come to mind for me at least. I certainly got overly enthusiastic about supply chain on the blockchain and things like tokenized real estate, which in hindsight I think is kind of obvious when you think about it from a user experience standpoint.
But provenance.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
provenance,
exactly.
it's authentic, which is, kind of a self-burn, as you said. The other, I think, a corollary to realizing it needs to be a 10x improvement for the user is also realizing where to put your business model. And that's been a learning for me as well, which is there's a reason that people are paying $700 of gas fees to do a transaction on Ethereum. And the reason they're doing that is because it's worth to them way, way more than that.
Yeah.
So rather than assume that everybody is psychotic and making mistakes, you can assume that people have pretty good information and are optimizing within their incentive set. And so if you're in an ecosystem where a transaction costs several $100s and still millions of people are executing those transactions all the time, and that's not going down, obviously we want gas fees to be lower, but it's a supply and demand outcome. And so as people build their economics, another thought is just going to the basics of where is the willingness to pay and where are you generating value?
Yeah, where are you generating value? The other thing that I would just touch on there real quick is understand your attack vector, right? So like basically every company competes on either price, quality, delivery, or customization. And so understanding, if you're not a pure financial, play, understanding where on those other three attack vectors can you compete on, and your users will tell you. They'll you don't have to get. I mean, you can make some assumptions and then you can test them, but your users will tell you where you can win on one of those four attack vectors, and then you just need to make sure that you have a 10x offer relative to my option in the marketplace.
Absolutely. Cool. I think we've covered a ton of great, insightful stuff. If our listeners want to figure out how to learn more about Tachyon and about you, where should they go?
Yeah, they can just go to tachyon.xyz and that'll take you to our homepage. Or you can follow me on Twitter. I'm pretty active there. Gabriel Anderso. So no N at the very end. Gabriel Anderso on Twitter. And my DMs are open. So I love meeting, love meeting new people, love meeting founders especially, and always happy to try to help out.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining today.
Appreciate it, Lex.
Hi, everyone. That's it for this week's episode of the FinTech Blueprint. For more technical deep dives into all things fintech and decentralized finance, check out fintechblueprint.com and grab a free subscription to the newsletter. This is Lex, and I'll see you next time.